My name is Michael Baxter, and I've been given the honor of introducing the speaker for this session. Richard Garnett received his BA in philosophy summa cum laude from Duke University in 1990 and his JD from Yale Law School in 1995. He served as senior editor of the Yale Law Journal and as editor of the Yale Journal of Law and the Humanities. After graduation, he clerked for Chief Judge Richard S. Arnold of the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit, and then for Chief Justice William Rehnquist. He practiced law for 2 years at the Washington, D.C. law firm of Miller Cassidy, LaRocca, and Lewin, specializing in criminal defense, religious liberty, and education reform matters. At Notre Dame, he teaches courses on criminal law, criminal procedure, First Amendment, and the death penalty. His areas of research and expertise include... Is it not on?
No.
Well, the little blue button says that it is. Blue, yeah. So much for the electronic revolution, huh? What do we got? Oh, look at that. Hey, way to go. See, he knows electronics, too. Look at that. Yeah, he's an Enlightenment man, Renaissance man. So his areas of expertise, in addition to electronics, are school choice, Catholic social thought, church-state relations, religion in the public square, free speech and expressive association, free exercise of religion, federalism in criminal law, the death penalty. I might add that Rick is a avid Duke basketball fan. We're looking for a good year. And his favorite skit on Saturday Night Live is Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer. So there's a story behind that, and if the Q&A goes slow, I'll tell it. But without further ado, we should welcome our speaker, Rick Garnett.
So now you see why it's really important that we have a very lively Q&A, because otherwise you'll hear that story and that'll be embarrassing. Well, thank you. I'm really honored. I'm proud to be a part of this wonderful conference and to be with you. All of us who care, and I believe we all should, about this university and about this university's mission, we owe a great debt to the Center for Ethics and Culture and to Professor David Solomon for organizing and hosting year after year this engaging and challenging and inspiring event. For me, and I know for many others, this event is a highlight of the academic year. I believe it's at the heart of this university's work. Maybe to borrow a phrase, this is where the church does its thinking. I have been asked to share with you some thoughts about religious freedom and about the protections that are afforded that freedom by our Constitution, that is, by the American Constitution. These are issues of great interest to me as a lawyer, as a scholar, as a teacher. They're also, for me, matters of profound sort of family history reasons, because an ancestor of mine, it turns out, was a rabble-rousing, anti-establishment Baptist minister in Virginia around the time of the American Revolution. And these matters are also important to me, as I suspect they are to many of you, as a citizen and as a religious believer. And I think it's appropriate that we're considering these matters at this event, which is a response to and is animated by Pope Benedict's summons of freedom. The Holy Father, after all, has expressed several times his admiration for what he's called the American model of religious freedom and of church-state relations. During his still recent visit to the United States, for example, he praised America's, quote, positive concept of secularism, in which the government respects both the role of religious arguments and commitments in the public square and the important distinction between religious and political authority. This positive concept, of course, should be contrasted with the aggressive, jealous, intolerant version of secularism, which is powerfully at work in many places, and which, as the journalist John Allen recently noted, the Pope is challenging us to resist. It's fundamental, the Pope observed not long ago in France, to insist on this distinction between the political realm and that of religion in order to preserve both the religious freedom of citizens and the responsibility of the state toward them. On the other hand, he continued, it is important to become more aware of the irreplaceable role of religion in the formation of conscience and the contributions which it can bring to the creation of a basic ethical consensus within society. Well, Thomas Jefferson regarded the religious freedom guarantees that were enacted into state and federal law after the Revolution as a fair and novel experiment. And it was the confident hope of James Madison that this bold experiment in religious liberty, one that rejected mere toleration and Jacobin anti-clericalism alike, that this experiment promised, as Judge Noonan has reminded us, a luster to our country. Madison believed, in other words, that a specifically American model of religious freedom was emerging, and that it would distinguish, shape, and strengthen us. He and other leaders among the founding generation appear to have been keenly aware that they were attempting something new, something that would change or perhaps even remake their world. To modern, sensitive, cosmopolitan ears, the early Americans seemed strikingly unburdened by a need to avoid triumphalism. Madison, for example, once confessed that it is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in the formation of the American Constitution a finger of the almighty hand. But even if they were not falsely modest, the founders were appropriately impressed by the weight of their responsibility. John Adams revealed as much when he wrote that the people in America have now the best opportunity and the greatest trust in their hands that Providence has ever committed to so small a number. Since the transgression of the first pair, if they betray their trust, their guilt will merit the indignation of heaven. Well, clearly, for America's religious liberty innovators, the pressure was on. So what then have we, the people in America, made of this best opportunity? Professor John Whitty of Emory, who's one of the leading scholars of religious liberty law in America, has reported that the bold constitutional experiment in granting religious liberty to all remains in place and in progress in the United States. And it does. But how goes that progress? Have we betrayed our trust with our efforts? Or has Madison hoped, and as the Holy Father seems to believe, has our American model of religious liberty added luster to our country? In my view, the American experiment in religious liberty is both vital and vulnerable. Our religious freedom protections are robust but incomplete. Our church-state arrangement is exemplary but confused. This much, though, seems clear. What was true at the founding remains for the most part true today, and that is that there are at work, in fact, several different models or ways of thinking about the freedom of religion under and through law. Indeed, to quote John Whitty again, the various competing models of Adams's day, and it should be recalled that there were competing models during Adams's day, that these competing models have borne ample progeny, and in Whitty's words, the great rivalries among them are fought out in the courts, legislatures, and academies throughout the land. Well, in my remarks today, I'm going to try to provide an overview of American religious liberty law and of this American model of healthy or positive secularism that the Pope has highlighted. And in so doing, I'm going to sketch rough outlines of a few different approaches to religious freedom and suggest that the American model actually consists of something of a competitive dialectic among these different approaches. And I'll identify, though I probably won't be able to elaborate, some of the challenges that this bold experiment faces and that must be overcome, if only to avoid dashing Madison's hopes for luster. I want to open, though, or continue to open, on something of a personal note. As you've heard, I teach and study and write just next door at the Notre Dame Law School. And there, my colleagues and I invite, and maybe I hope we occasionally inspire, our students to bring their commitments and their hopes to their studies. This is how we describe Notre Dame Law School's distinctive Catholic character. We challenge them to carry all of these things, these commitments, these hopes with them in good repair and perhaps better understood from school back out into their lives in the law. In our view, we can't expect young lawyers to think deeply and well about service or justice or the common good if we tell them to privatize their ideals or to radically separate the meaning of life from the practice of law. And so we urge students to approach their vocations, and lawyering should be a vocation, as whole persons. We challenge them to integrate what they do with what they profess and with what they cherish. We ask them to remember always who they are, what they believe, where they came from, and whom they love, and to resist any temptation or demand to check their faith at the door of their professional and public lives. Now, with respect to our topic here today, that is religious freedom in America, I start from a proposition that is quite similar to the challenge that we issue our students. We are entirely free, and our laws should protect and nourish this freedom, to participate in public life and to cooperate and contend with our fellow citizens in seeking and securing the common good as whole, integrated, non-pulverized persons. The philosopher was right. We are political animals. We are also, however, creatures made in the image and likeness of God, and we are hardwired to search for and cling to the one who sustains and loves us. It is our nature, then. It is part of what it means to be human, to be both religious and political. And I would insist that nothing in the text, history, or structure of the American Constitution, rightly understood, requires us to deny this bedrock fact of moral anthropology. Nothing in America's traditions require us to accept disintegration as the price of admission to the practice of engaged, responsible citizenship. Now, to be sure, and I'll say more about this later, we have wisely distinguished or separated the institutions and authorities of religion from those of government. But we do this, though, not so much by building a wall, but by respecting the genuine autonomy of these different spheres. And we do this not to cage, but precisely to protect religious freedom, recognizing, as the Holy Father has put it, that this distinction is a decisive factor for freedom, which includes the freedom to construct and live a faithful, integrated, balanced public life. So our law, I believe, should exhibit a similar balance, a balance that reflects and protects the liberty of religious conscience, the independence of religious authorities, and the importance of a religiously inspired public morality. Now, such a balance isn't achieved in the abstract. It's struck in the context of real-world disputes. And in America today, of course, such disputes are not in short supply. In fact, religious liberty controversies and religion in the public square questions are everywhere. They're unavoidable. For example, should the Pledge of Allegiance recited by school children include the words "under God"? Should we permit religious holiday displays in front of government buildings, or depictions of the Ten Commandments on courthouse walls, or war memorial crosses in the wilds of the Mojave Desert? Should we exempt religiously motivated drug use from the scope of narcotics laws, or church renovation projects from the reach of historical preservation rules? Should a lawyer in a murder trial appeal to jurors' religiously grounded opposition to the death penalty? Should a legislator's belief that all human life is sacred affect her vote on public funding for embryo-destructive research? Or a voter's Catholic commitment to the preferential option for the poor determine her views on a proposed minimum wage increase? Should public officials invoke God in public, or open official events with prayer? Should poor children be allowed to use public funds to attend a parochial or other religious school? May a faith-based organization or a Christian university take religion into account when hiring and firing counselors and faculty? May a government require Catholic charities to pay for employees' contraceptives or to place children for adoption with same-sex couples? May a judge review the decision of a bishop to close a parish, or order a bankrupt diocese to close a homeless shelter, or supervise the selection and training of clergy, or award church property to a breakaway congregation, and so on, and so on. Engaging and answering these and similar questions requires us to identify the foundations and the content and the limits of the freedom of religion that is celebrated in our traditions. So how should we go about this task? And again, how well are we doing it today? Now, I'm going to confess at this point that I am one of those knuckle-dragging unsophisticates, hence my affection for the caveman lawyer skit, I suppose, who believe that the meaning of the Constitution is actually connected to its history, that words have meaning and text matters, and that we should be healthily skeptical of legal arguments that are dissonant with our national experience. And so if we want to responsibly and faithfully enforce the Constitution's religious freedom provisions, it seems to me we need to examine closely the way these provisions were understood at the time they became law, and understand as well the way that their meaning has evolved throughout our experience. Before we can assess the performance of our courts and the merits of our laws today, we need to recall our fair and novel experiments animating premises. Well, President Clinton once said that religious freedom is literally our first freedom. And his point, I think, was not the insignificant one that religious liberty happens to come first in the Bill of Rights. It didn't originally, as it happens. It was instead that the freedom of religion was central to the founders' vision for the American political community. The freedom of religion was not only an object of their protective concern. It was also, they thought, a crucial prerequisite for the success of their enterprise. Now, to say this, we need to be careful. It's not to endorse this, the misleading assertion that America was, in quotes, a Christian nation. It is simply to observe that our Constitution was not designed to displace or defeat religion, or to replace it with state worship or a sanctified politics. It was made instead, in John Adams' words, for a moral and religious people, whose republican institutions in many ways presuppose a supreme being, and depend, as Tocqueville said, for their maintenance on the country's religious aspect. Of course, as Judge Noonan has reminded us, what the founders' religious liberty formula meant had to be worked out. And Adams predicted a glorious uncertainty in the law of religious liberty, and a noble diversity of understandings of its details. History has confirmed his view. The early Americans, like Americans today, did not always agree about what precisely the freedom of religion means, or about how precisely it should be protected in law. The founders were not all Puritans, nor were they all Jefferson-style Enlightenment theorists. Still, they knew, as we do, that religious freedom matters. And they knew that unless our most sacred things are protected from the grubby goals, but also the commendable ones, of state functionaries, all of our other freedoms of speech, of the press, of conscience, are vulnerable. Religious freedom was seen, as it should be, as part of the structure of a free society, not merely as a concession made by a tolerant sovereign. As we consider the state of religious freedom in America today, then, it can't be emphasized enough that the protections provided in our text and tradition are not accidents or anomalies or anachronisms. They're not aberrations in our secular state. Quite the contrary. Ours is, as the Pope, I think, correctly has diagnosed, a positive secularism. At least it should be. And accordingly, in our traditions, religious freedom is cherished as a basic human right and as a non-negotiable aspect of human dignity. At least it should be. Now, it's not simplifying things too much, even if it is simplifying them a little bit, to say that this American insight into the centrality of religious freedom was embraced at the Second Vatican Council in the landmark Declaration on Religious Liberty. That document proclaimed, of course, as we've heard at other sessions during this conference, that the human person has a right to religious freedom, a right that has its foundation in the dignity and the very nature of the human person, a right that reflects the fact that all men and women are endowed with reason and free will, and therefore privileged to bear personal responsibility. So our Constitution at its best and properly understood does not regard religious faith with a grudging suspicion as a quaint relic left over from a simpler past. The purpose of the text is not to push religion to the margins in the hopes that it will wither, but rather to protect it in the hopes that it will thrive. Now, in accord with, then, this American model of religious freedom, that freedom is seen as a fundamental natural right, which can coexist with the political community's obligations to secure public order. Under this model, the law does not purport to exclude religious believers and values from public life and from the civic conversation. Instead, it protects everyone, believers and non-believers alike, against coercion in religious matters. It leaves to voluntary and other associations of civil society the responsibility of religious education and evangelization, but it protects the right to carry out that responsibility. The right to public religion is protected, as is the freedom of private religion. Church and state are separate, not in the sense that faith is excluded from politics, after all, such an exclusion would be impossible, but in the healthy sense that the institutions and authorities of government are separate from and prevented from interfering with the proper independence of the institutions and authorities of religion. This model is secular in the sense that laws and policies are not supplied directly by religious authority, but it's positive in that the understanding of human flourishing that it is designed to promote includes the search for religious truth and the sanctity of religious conscience. As John Courtney Murray insisted, the American experiment should be seen as an attempt to secure religious liberty and authentic human flourishing through constitutional limits on interference by government with religion. Now, this is the American model at its best. At the same time, as I've already suggested, it's not the only one that is or has been at work in the United States. Nor is it the case that American courts and judges and officials always act in accord with this model. It's easy to find stories in the media, in the law books, involving public officials who have neglected this model's fundamental premises, even turning them upside down, treating citizens' public religious expression with suspicion rather than with even-handedness or respect. Well, what goes wrong in these cases where we see this topsy-turviness of our religious freedom premises? In my view, it is not so much that we are seeing a hostility to religion on the part of these decision makers. Instead, we are seeing, in my view, more often a misunderstanding of the American premises. Now, the good news is that increasingly in the last 2 decades, federal courts have tended to vindicate the constitutional rule that governments may not discriminate against religious ideas or religious people. The court, for the most part, continues to reaffirm that the Constitution neither requires nor permits state actors to single out religious expression for unfavorable treatment. And this makes sense. As Justice Scalia once put it, the freedom of speech without religion would be like Hamlet without the prince. The misunderstanding, though, that leads some courts to believe that a commitment to church-state separation requires the marginalization of religion or its exclusion from the public conversation, I think that misunderstanding reflects this competition to which I alluded earlier, this tension between at least 3 different approaches to religious freedom in America today. These 3 approaches can be characterized, I think, as freedom from religion, freedom of religion, and freedom for religion. Now, there is, I should note, a 4th possibility, and that is theocracy, or direct rule by religious authorities. But this is not a live option in America. And despite what you might have been reading in recent days in some of our leading newspapers about the unholy influence of the bishops on healthcare policy, theocracy, again, is not a live option in this country. The first approach, then, freedom from religion, accepts religion as a social reality. How could it not? But it regards it primarily as a danger to the common good, as a practice that should be tolerated but confined to the private personal realm. On this view, it's bad taste, or worse, to bring religion into discussions of public policy. Freedom from religion is freedom in the sense that those invoking it are seeking to be free from the influence of what they regard as religiously inspired morality in law and constraining their own behavior. Under this model, as Professor Stephen Carter has memorably put it, religion is like building model airplanes, just another hobby. Ideally something quiet, something trivial, not really a fit activity for intelligent adults. Well, consistent with this approach, religious freedom and religious belief is protected, but the permissible implications and expressions of those beliefs are limited. Under this approach, the dominant concern is the domestication of religion and its assimilation to the often relativistic ideology of the state. The role of law and government is to maintain strictly a boundary between private religion and public life. It is certainly not to support, and only rarely to accommodate, religious practice and formation. Now, this model has found some expression in American law and policy, both in the past and occasionally today. As I've indicated, though, this freedom from approach is not true to the Constitution, to religious liberty properly understood, or I think even to the nature of the human person. And thankfully, its influence seems more pronounced among academics than among Americans generally. The second approach, freedom of religion, tends to emphasize toleration, neutrality, equal treatment. Religion on this view is something that matters to many people, and so the law does not permit it to be singled out for special hostility. Equality is the governing fundamental norm. It's recognized and accepted that religious believers and institutions are at work in society. It's accepted that they do some good. And the stance or response of the law toward these institutions and activities is one of even-handedness, again, of neutrality. Because we are all entitled to express our views, the argument goes, and because we're all entitled to live in accord with our consciences, religious believers are so entitled too. The law should be religion blind. Now, this model is not hostile to, at least not overtly hostile to religion, but it's also reluctant to regard religion as something special. Religious liberty is just liberty, and liberty is something to which we all have an equal right. Religion is not something to be singled out for accommodations or privileges or encouragement or endorsement, or for burdens or disadvantages. Religious conscience is a dimension of conscience, and religious commitment, expression, and motivation are all, in the end, matters of taste and private preference. They're not scary, but they're not special. Now, this model represents an improvement, certainly, on the freedom from model, and it, too, has been reflected in American law. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that this model's influence is much more pronounced in the Supreme Court's recent decisions. The justices have emphasized, for example, that officials may not treat religiously motivated speech worse than speech that reflects other so-called viewpoints. Again, recall Justice Scalia's observation about Hamlet without the prince. Courts have ruled that public funds may be allocated to religiously affiliated schools and to social welfare agencies, so long as they are providing some secular public good. And these funds should be provided on the same terms as they're provided to non-religious social service agencies. At the same time, though, governments are not required to provide special accommodations to religious believers. They're not required to exempt religiously motivated conduct from the reach of generally applicable laws. So if, for example, the government decides to protect bald eagles, it's not required, on this view, to exempt those who practice Native American religions and use eagle feathers in their rituals. Religion may be accommodated on this model, but it need not be. Now, finally, a third approach, freedom for religion. This model, in my view, represents the American experiment in healthy secularism at its best. In this model, the search for religious truth is acknowledged as an important human activity. Religion is special, and not just because it's specially dangerous. Its exercise is seen as valuable and good and worthy of accommodation, even support. The idea is not, to be clear, that the public authority should demand religious observances or establish religious orthodoxy. It is instead that a political community committed to positive secularity can and should take note of the fact that people long for the transcendent, that they are by nature called to search for the truth and for God. The appropriately secular limited state will not prescribe the path this search should take, but it will take steps, positive steps, to make sure that freedom for religion and the conditions necessary for the exercise of religious freedom and the infrastructure on which religious freedom depends, that all these are nurtured. So the government under this approach will not only refrain from discriminating against religion, it will take special care to accommodate and facilitate it, although always in a way that respects the distinction between the authorities of religion and the authorities of politics, between church and state. On this approach, the government not only avoids imposing unnecessary burdens on religion, it also looks for ways to lift such burdens where they exist. An example of such a burden lifting, I think, are the various provisions that exempt religious institutions from tax laws. And of course, as you've probably heard in the news, some of these accommodations are vulnerable today. Now, it's certainly the case, and many commentators and scholars and judges have complained about this, that American law dealing with religious liberty is not entirely coherent. Understatement of the day. This is in part because of the tensions between and among these three approaches that we've been discussing. But things could be worse. In my view, they have improved as we have been moving away from the freedom from thinking and moving toward freedom of and even freedom for. And I have to say, I think my former employer, the late Chief Justice Rehnquist, deserves some of the credit for this development. As I noted earlier, the American experiment in religious freedom is vital and vulnerable. Our religious freedom protections are robust but incomplete. Our church-state arrangement is exemplary but confused. So what are the sources of this confusion? What explains, in other words, our waffling and wavering among these different approaches? What explains our failure to fully embrace the implications of the freedom for model? I want to suggest just two possibilities. The first is a failure to appreciate that there is an intermediate social realm that exists between the purely private and the purely public. Between the personal sphere and the government sphere is this large, busy, boisterous, crucially important sphere of civil society. Almost everyone agrees that religion is protected in the purely private realm, and also that the realm of government and its laws should remain secular. But what is sometimes forgotten, and again, this accounts for some of the confusion, is that a healthy secularism can and should tolerate and welcome religion in public, in civil society. The First Amendment, remember, limits governments only. It says what governments may not do. It has nothing to say about private action, other than to confirm that religious expression, exercise, and worship are worth protecting, even in public. Citizens cannot violate the First Amendment when we engage in public discourse and political activity. Even bishops cannot violate the First Amendment. Officials in courts, however, can if they attempt to exclude religious voices or to silence religious arguments. You've heard this before. The Establishment Clause is not the government's sword driving private religious expression from the marketplace of ideas. Rather, it constrains government and serves as a shield which protects religiously motivated speech and action. Judge Michael McConnell, who is now a professor at Stanford Law School, captured the idea succinctly. If a group of people get together and form a church, that's the free exercise of religion. If the government forms a church, that's an establishment of religion. One is protected, one is forbidden. The question then is not whether the First Amendment is violated when religious believers or arguments enter public life. It's whether the Constitution is offended when they are excluded. The Constitution, again, does not demand what Richard Newhouse famously called the naked public square, nor does it tolerate efforts by government to create one. It imposes no don't ask, don't tell rule on religious believers who participate in public life. It imposes no special obligation on them to sterilize their speech before entering this intermediate civil society realm. If a member of the Sierra Club or the AARP can bring her values into public life, then so can a member of the United Methodist Church. Now, there are plenty of reasons, of course, for reasonable and faithful believers to decide that not every religious argument needs to be not every political argument needs to be a religious argument. And although religious leaders have, I believe, an obligation to teach and to bear witness to the truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable, it's also true that there are many questions about which reasonable and faithful believers can disagree. It compromises the faith if we water it down to avoid offense, but it also disrespects religion if we offer clunky, hasty baptisms of our preferred policy proposals. Now, the Supreme Court of the United States has observed that under our Constitution, religion must be a private matter for the individual. Clearly, few would disagree with this claim, that is, the claim that religion is private, if this claim is taken to refer to an entirely appropriate respect on the government's part for freedom of religious conscience and for the autonomy of religious institutions. This claim should not be taken to mean, though, that religious expression and witness have no place in civil society, or that religious faith has nothing to say about questions of social justice and public policy. William James once quipped that in this age of toleration, no one will ever try actively to interfere with our religious faith, provided we enjoy it quietly with our friends and do not make a public nuisance. Lots of strange things can be tolerated if they're kept private. Sometimes, though, religious believers are called precisely to make a public nuisance. That is, to engage respectfully their fellow citizens in dialogue about how we should live together. There is no reason for people who embrace, and we all should, democracy and pluralism to insist that religious citizens need not speak and act as if their faith had no consequences for state and society. Again, the Constitution protects our right to keep our faith private. However, it does not, as I said earlier, require us to privatize our faith. And it would be highly presumptuous for government to instruct religious believers as to the limited scope of religion's concerns. Judge Janice Rogers Brown put the matter well several years ago when she noted that many religious traditions have never envisioned the sharp divide between the church and the world, the spiritual and the temporal, or religion and politics. In these traditions, the internal spiritual life of believers and institutions must always move outward as a sign, an instrument for the transformation of the larger society. The second source of the confusion that characterizes religious freedom in America today has to do with this principle of separation of church and state. This is, in my view, one of the more often misunderstood terms in the American conversation about religion and public life. What does it mean, really? What does it have to do with religious freedom? Well, step back with me for a moment to kinder, gentler days. In 1988, while out on the campaign trail, then Vice President George H.W. Bush recalled his experience as a young pilot in World War II being shot down over the South Pacific. And you can insert here sort of Dana Carvey's voice for mine. He said, "Was I scared floating in a little yellow raft off the coast of an enemy-held island, setting the world record for paddling? Of course I was. And what sustains you in times like that? Well, you go back to fundamental values. I thought about Mother and Dad and the strength I got from them. I thought about God and faith and the separation of church and state." Now, this train of thought, I hope, strikes us as a bit absurd. It's entirely American. That God and faith could not be invoked by the would-be president as fundamental values without this awkward addition of the separation of church and state speaks volumes, for better or worse, about how we Americans think about the content of our first freedom. And again, it illustrates this confusing competition among these different approaches to religious liberty. Now, as many of you know, an earlier president, Thomas Jefferson, in his 1801 letter to the Danbury Baptists, a campaign fundraising letter I've always thought, famously professed his sovereign reverence for what he saw as the decision of the American people to constitutionalize church-state separation. And in so doing, he supplied what is for many the authoritative interpretation of the First Amendment. Professor Dreisbach observed not too long ago that, quote, "No metaphor in American letters has had greater influence on law and policy than Thomas Jefferson's, quote, wall of separation between church and state." Jefferson's words, as Professor Philip Hamburger has observed, seem to have shaped the nation. And for many of us, they're more familiar than the words of the First Amendment itself. But the fact that we're familiar or even intimate with Jefferson's words, that they occur to us when we're in the South Pacific, hardly means that we agree about their meaning. Notwithstanding our third president's reverence for church-state separation, and notwithstanding the comfort that's applied to our 41st president, the idea remains controversial and contestable. What does it mean, really, for church and state to be separate? Is church-state separation even an imaginable reality, let alone a constitutional requirement? Or our professors Eisgruber and Sager right to insist in their important book that, quote, "church and state are not separate in the United States and could not possibly be separate." Now, what about the recent, not so recent anymore, assertion by Representative Katherine Harris of Bush versus Gore fame that the separation of church and state is a lie, we have been told, to keep religious believers out of politics and public life? This charge, it seems to me, is well off the mark. And yet there's no denying that separation is often presented, both by its opponents and by many of its self-styled defenders, as an aggressively anti-religious program, rather than, as John Courtney Murray once put it, a policy to implement the principle of religious freedom. Well, solid scholarship has made it clear that Thomas Jefferson's views on religion, reflected in his invocation of the so-called wall of separation, were unrepresentative in his own day. It was a mistake when Justice Hugo Black, writing for the court in 1947, constitutionalized what Justice Rehnquist would later call Jefferson's misleading metaphor. And, as Justice Rehnquist reminded us, it's impossible to build sound constitutional law on a mistaken understanding of constitutional history, or for that matter, on a figure of speech. All that said, the distinction between and the separation of religious and government authority is crucial to America's healthy secularism. It's crucial also to religious freedom more generally. Contrary to the clumsy claims of some activists and politicians, the separation of church and state, when it's properly understood, is not a lie. Pope Benedict XVI was clear and correct in his encyclical letter Deus Caritas Est. Fundamental to Christianity, he wrote, is the distinction between what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God. In other words, the distinction between church and state, or the autonomy of the temporal sphere. In a similar vein, he has emphasized that it was Christianity that brought the idea of separation of church and state into the world. Until then, the political constitution and religion were always united. It was a norm in all cultures for the state to have sacredness in itself and to be the supreme protector of the sacred. Christianity, however, deprived the state of its sacred nature. And in this sense, the Pope insisted, separation is ultimately a primordial Christian legacy. So returning to the three models discussed earlier, the three approaches, we can see that separation, understood in this positive way, is not only consistent with, but it reflects well the freedom for religion approach. It need not be yoked to the misguided freedom from, or even to the excessively wary freedom of model. The institutional and jurisdictional separation of religious and political authority, the independence of religious communities from government oversight and control, a strict rule against formal religious tests for public office. These separationist features of our constitutional order have helped religious faith to thrive in America. They have helped to shore up freedom for religion. Properly understood, the separation of church and state, then, is not an anti-religious ideology or an invention of the ACLU, but is instead a safeguard against governments tempted to assume for themselves the power to direct religious life. Now, as I noted earlier, some would argue that the separation of church and state requires governments to scrub clean the public square of all religious residue. We can see now, though, I hope, that this view of church-state separation is just as mistaken as the claim that it's a lie. It's untrue to the vision of our founders and to the text of our Constitution. To quote Murray again, arguments like these stand the First Amendment on its head, and in that position it can only gurgle nonsense. Our Constitution separates church and state not to confine religious belief, but to curb the ambitions of government. In our laws, Caesar recognizes that he is only Caesar and forswears any attempt to demand what is God's. The church is not above or controlling. It's not beneath and subordinate to the state. It is separate. It's independent. And so it and religious believers are more free. Now, some probably thought it was strange, bizarre even, when the Holy Father endorsed so forcefully the idea of church-state separation. Some might have wondered if they should be for it anymore, given the Holy Father's endorsement. They should not have been surprised, though. Remember that nearly 1,000 years ago, the excommunicated German Emperor Henry IV stood barefoot in the snow outside Countess Matilda's castle in Canossa, Italy, seeking reconciliation with Pope Gregory VII. The Pope, as you know, had refused to give in to the Emperor's assertion of power to appoint bishops. These 3 days, when Henry IV was standing in the snow in Italy, are, I believe, as important to the development of Western constitutionalism as are later events at Runnymede and Philadelphia and Appomattox. The great legal scholar Harold Berman has described Pope Gregory VII as waging a historic struggle with secular powers for self-government by the church. In so doing, he led a revolution that worked nothing less than a total transformation of law, state, and society. And the battle cry for this revolution, an idea that, according to Berman, would serve as the catalyst for the first major turning point in European history and as the foundation for a millennium of political theory, was the freedom of the church. Here, and not in Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists, are the foundations of church-state separation rightly understood. This freedom of the church, claimed by Pope Gregory, was the independence of the church from secular control. What was at stake at the Countess's castle then, as was also at stake at the cathedral in Canterbury a century later, was the principle that royal jurisdiction is not unlimited, and that it was not for the secular authority to decide where the boundaries should be fixed. In George Weigel's words, thanks to the freedom of the church and to the resolution of the investiture controversy in favor of the church, the state would not be all in all. The state would not occupy every inch of social space. The state had to acknowledge that there were some things it couldn't do because it was simply incompetent to do them. And that acknowledgement of limited competence created the social and cultural conditions for the possibility of what a later generation of Democrats and constitutionalists called the limited state. This idea of the freedom of the church is at the heart of the Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Religious Freedom, and it's crucial to America's model of positive secularism correctly understood. And so to insist that church and state should be separate is not to lie, nor is it to imagine that a high wall between faith and public life is desirable or even possible. It's not to unrealistically privatize religion or impose a no-God rule on policy debates, leaving behind only the shallow vocabulary of cost-benefit analysis. It is instead to affirm the independence of religious institutions from government supervision. This independence protects individuals' freedoms, believers and non-believers alike. Unfortunately, this independence is vulnerable. It's even under attack in some quarters and in some contexts today. Well, why is it vulnerable if I'm right that, generally speaking, American law observes a positive secularism? Well, it's not new to observe that American judicial decisions and public conversations about religion tend to focus on matters of individuals' rights, beliefs, consciences, practices. And so the distinctive place and the structural role and the freedoms of religious groups and associations and institutions are often overlooked. But an understanding of religious faith and of religious freedom that stops with the liberty of the individual conscience and that neglects institutions and communities will be incomplete, and so will the legal arrangements that such an understanding produces. I want to mention just one example to illustrate this point about the freedom of the church being threatened, or at least vulnerable. As a general matter, as many of you know, American law does not permit organizations to discriminate on the basis of certain characteristics like race, sex, national origin, and religion. But the law tends to exempt religious organizations from this ban on religious discrimination. And I think we should put aside for now the interesting question whether taking religion into account really constitutes discrimination when it's done by religious organizations. The ban on racial and other forms of discrimination, though, continues to apply, even to religious nonprofits. Now, in most cases, this prohibition won't interfere with the religious liberty of a church, or even with its right to self-government. But in some cases, though, it might. And these cases are increasingly controversial in American law. So should a Catholic university have to answer to a court for its decision to fire a chaplain? Should the diocese have to answer to a court for a decision to fire a catechist, or perhaps a music director? Should a religious school be subject to a discrimination lawsuit if it fires a teacher for setting a bad moral example? And is the day coming when churches will face lawsuits in the civil courts for discriminating against women in the training and ordaining of clergy? Religious liberty questions like these, in my view, are more important and difficult and pressing than the ones that so often occupy our attention, the ones about creches and reindeer and crosses in the desert. And their resolution will put to test America's commitment to positive secularism, to what I have called the Freedom For model. After all, one of the necessary conditions for the flourishing of religious freedom, a condition to which, given the Freedom For approach, the government should attend, is the freedom of religious communities and associations to govern themselves in accord with their own teaching. And so it should be cause for concern that it is widely and increasingly believed that liberal values and non-discrimination norms should not only constrain state action, and they should, but also inform state action constraining non-state actors and religious associations. The danger, in the words of American theologian Stanley Hauerwas, is that the very means used to ensure that the democratic state be a limited state, that is, the means of the law, will turn out to be no less destructive for intermediate institutions than was the monistic state of Marxism. Some today regard churches and their autonomy as dangerous centers of potentially oppressive power, which are in need of supervision and regulation by the state in its capacity as protector of individual liberty and conscience. However, given that the freedom of the church is not easily separated from the history and health of constitutionally limited government, we should worry that, in Professor Hamburger's words, the illiberal expansion of liberal ideas could become a threat to freedom. Well, I opened with Madison's suggestion, that our experiment in religious freedom would add luster to our country, and I believe that it has. Again, the state of religious freedom today in America is vulnerable but vital. The model to which we should be aspiring, freedom for religion, continues to compete with others. Stay tuned. Thank you.
Professor Garnett to field some questions. Stay right up there, and I'll
Mr. Watson.
take people if I see enough feedback.
You as you were talking, I was thinking back to the, and you'll probably remember the name, the Peyote case, where Justice Scalia outlined the generally applicable idea. What is the, and a talk Justice Scalia gave, and I don't know if he ever printed it, he said something to the effect of, if the law on minors receiving communion in the Catholic Church for underage alcohol consumption were challenged, he would have to uphold the challenge and overturn that exemption, and then he would probably likely resign as a Supreme Court justice. What is the line there for religious freedom on that generally applicable law if someone were to say, well, look, the Catholic Church has all these minors consuming alcohol regularly from Saturday evening to Sunday evening?
Look at swine flu.
Right. There's a massive violation of generally applicable laws going on here. Where's that line drawn, and where do you think it should be drawn? Give me your talk.
Well, it's a great question. I'll try to respond without descending too far into sort of law geekery, but as was just suggested, the current rule in the Supreme Court is that governments aren't required to give special exemptions to religiously motivated conduct. If it's illegal to drive 90 miles an hour, it's also illegal to drive 90 miles an hour on your way to church. Right? Now, many have characterized this position, Justice Scalia's position, as being in tension with or a challenge to religious freedom, especially to freedom for religion, as I've been describing it. I'm clearly in the minority on this. I'm not sure I disagree, and here's why. What the court in Smith said, I believe, is not that religious exemptions should not be granted, not that the freedom for religion should not be observed. Instead, the court's concern was had to do with the comparative competence between political actors on the one hand and judges on the other. So, what the Smith case that you're describing was really about was about the power of judges to create these exemptions from generally applicable laws. I think Justice Scalia took care at the end of that opinion to sort of remind his readers it's consistent with the American experience for legislators to give these kinds of exemptions. Just don't ask us to do it. You all do it. So I think that Smith rule, which some would say illustrates the mere freedom of religion, right, equal treatment, neutrality, I think it's consistent with the freedom for model. It's just a question of which institutional actors are charged with taking care that religious freedom is appropriately respected.
Now, just a quick follow-up, sorry. If one were to delve into something like the Catholic Church and say, you have minors, boozing it up there, as some secular challenger might say, would that not require the state to actually delve into the legitimacy of that, as opposed to, hey, we've just formed a church and now everyone's going to smoke marijuana all evening, and hey, that's part of our religious ideas. Doesn't that require the state to go ahead and delve into those, or would it just abide by whatever the legislature had said that you suggest Justice Scalia said?
Yeah, I could be misunderstanding. I mean, there certainly is a danger that a court, when it's trying to decide whether or not it should create an exemption from a general law, that it's going to be affected by its own views, by a judge's views about how sort of legitimate the practices in question are. And so this is always one of the worries about the Smith decision, is that majoritarian religions with which we're comfortable will get favorable treatment, and minority religions that are strange to us won't. We live in a world of the second best. I think Justice Scalia's answer to that is to say, if we live in a world where the political authority, where the legislators insist on applying the ban on alcohol for minors to kids taking a sip of communion time, then we have much bigger problems than just the role of federal judges. Yes, sir.
I wondered if you spoke about the confusion that exists between the rule and regulation of the state and of the church, and I wonder if we don't sometimes contribute to that confusion by, say, religious institutions, Catholic colleges being beneficiaries of government grants, government loans to assist students to attend those institutions, tax benefits in order to promote the financial welfare of the institution. So we're sort of in the wallet of the government, as it were, and giving them therefore entree to dictate certain matters within religious institutions. So do we kind of aid and abet that confusion? I just wondered what your thought might be about being chary, perhaps, about being beneficiaries of that government money.
Look, he who pays the price for a call is assumed, right? And this is always the concern about religious institutions taking public funds is that strings come with those funds, and that complying with those regulatory strings could compromise the church's witness and its authenticity and so forth. That is a danger. In some instances, it's a reality. But not all strings, not all regulatory strings are inconsistent with religious freedom, it seems to me. I mean, if the government says, here's $1,000 to run a soup kitchen, but you can't use it to buy new missiles, MSSALS, that's a permissible string, right? Here's a part of the confusion. I think the problem is not so much that the church or religious institutions take public funds in order to provide what many people regard as public services. I mean, the church is providing a public good, and it's entirely appropriate that the government should chip in for that public good. The danger, and this is one that I think we have to be attentive to in politics, is that the government seems to imagine that just because the church takes some public funds, the church takes some public funds, that the church therefore needs to act just like the government. I mean, we're seeing this in the debate about faith-based institutions right now, right? That faith-based initiatives. That if a Catholic-run soup kitchen takes the money, then it has to take the crosses off the wall or can't hire and fire on the basis of religion. Those are strings that, in my view, shouldn't be attached to public funds, and we should resist them being attached. The Constitution certainly doesn't require them. Right? So, in my view, the freedom for religion approach is one that can welcome these kind of cooperative arrangements between the government and the church. But a government that respects the freedom for religion approach will think to itself, we don't need to remake these religious institutions in our own image. We can leave them free to be distinctive, because it's precisely as distinctive institutions that they play this important structural role in civil society and deliver public services perhaps in a new and creative way. Yes, ma'am.
I've heard of instances in Europe with clergymen being fined and even jailed for preaching that homosexual acts were sinful and so forth. And I've heard people who are saying that we're going to have the same thing happening if hate speech legislation goes forward. Do you think that's just being alarmist, or do you think that's a real possibility and as an example of freedom from religion?
Yeah. Well, I do think there are plenty of reasons for reasonable people to be concerned about this increasing tendency to think that hateful speech should be punished. And we're seeing more of this in Europe than we are here, but there was a new law or new resolution going into effect over there saying that defamation of religion should be prescribable. Now, on the one hand, that sounds kind of nice to someone like me. I don't want religion defamed, right? But once you get the government in the position of policing what counts as defamation of religion, it's dangerous to the freedom of speech. The cases you mentioned about, pastors preaching against same-sex marriage or homosexual conduct in their own churches, I'm actually only aware of one case, I think it was in Sweden, where that actually happened. It's more been something that, oh my God, what if that ever happened? It has happened, again, very occasionally. I think only once so far, but maybe you know of another example. I don't think it will happen here. I think even with the passage of this hate crimes law, which again might be bad policy as a criminal justice matter, I think the commitment in America to this kind of small L libertarian freedom of speech regime is still pretty strong, and so I would be surprised if it went that far here, which again isn't to say we should be complacent. And there are instances even here where I worry that the line is being approached, right? But I do think no need to be alarmist, but no need to be complacent. Way in the back.
Jefferson's language of the wall of separation, you point out well, is perhaps the most visible, publicly used rhetoric. Talks about how to think about religion in America. I wonder two things. First, if you're aware of a older conversation about such a wall that is biblically grounded. Roger Williams talks about how the wall dividing the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world. And he uses Isaiah 5 here as a metaphor, where, of course, he intends this to be a wall that preserves and protects the holiness of the church. Blessing, really, given by God that Christians should keep in good repair, and Williams, waxing apocalyptic, supposes that if the Christians of the current age don't keep it in good repair and sort of let it break down, then God will let the whole thing crumble.
Yeah, I am aware of that tradition, and I think it was a very powerful piece. It's now about 40 years old by Mark DeWolf Powell, who's a professor at Harvard Law School, who suggested, I think provocatively, that if Williams's take on the wall, that is, that separation is a principle that protects the church, had been the dominant influence in the development of American thinking, as opposed to Jefferson's, things might look quite a bit better. Now, Williams's image and its current kind of popularity, I mean, Martha Nussbaum has made it the centerpiece of her new book on law and religion, is, in my view, a healthy thing. It's a good thing that we're looking at Williams, but there's no evidence actually that the founding generation was paying any attention to him at all. Certainly Jefferson was not. That's not even clear that Jefferson never would have heard of that particular garden in the wilderness image. So it's one of these things that I think Williams's image captures an important truth. It's one that we should employ today. I think it's consistent with, even if it's not the same as, he probably would have been horrified to hear this, consistent with Gregory VII's thinking. But it's not. It's probably not something that you could say actually influenced the formation of the American
Whatever
Constitution.
Jefferson knew, the interesting connection, of course, is that he was writing as a Virginia Baptist who would have claimed Roger Williams as a sort of prized interpreter of what...
Well, he's writing to Connecticut Baptist.
Connecticut, things different as far as the early Baptists would have been concerned. Roger Williams would have been their hero and the principal list through which they would have interpreted this. Whether that tradition can be recovered or not is an interesting question, but it offers so much more, it seems, to us than Jefferson.
Well, I agree with you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder whether there is a fourth approach to thinking about the relationship between the state and the church, or to think about religious freedom. I'm thinking the approach which appeals to equality. According to this approach, the state should treat its citizens with equal respect and concern. And if we agree with this notion of equality, then we should treat its citizens equally with regard to religious matters. And from this, we have to adopt our new neutrality policy. Our political constitutions or institutions, law or public policy should be based on something which is neutral, should not be based on a particular religious doctrines or religious concern. So I wonder whether that kind of model would be compatible with your third model.
Well, I think what you say is helpful, and I meant to suggest that this freedom of religion model, the second of the three I talked about, actually is, at the end of the day, a model that calls to the surface, that emphasizes equality, neutrality, even-handedness. So I think what you were suggesting as a possible fourth was really my second, to the extent that matters. And it's certainly one that's influential and important today, right? This idea that neutrality is a meaningful and a meaningful ideal that's possible for government to achieve, that it should shape government policy with respect to religion, right? That religion need not be discriminated against, but it also ought not to be preferred. That religious people's liberty is protected just like everybody's liberty is protected, that religious freedom is just a species of freedom. All of those kinds of ideas, I think, are consistent with what you're saying, and I meant to incorporate them into this freedom of religion model, which, again, it has a lot of influence in American law today, and it has much to recommend it in some circumstances. I've tried to suggest that it doesn't quite catch all that religious freedom should mean, and that extra bit that it misses is what I mean for the freedom for religion approach to capture. Mike, do you want to go ahead? I don't want to miss anybody.
I wanted to follow up on the question about a couple of events in Europe, and just and more generalize it, with the increasing role of the international community in law, cosmopolitan law, influences crossing national boundaries. I'm wondering how you see this model working out in the international community, and is this model, is it exportable, and in the reverse direction, is it vulnerable if the discussion in the international community tends towards the from or the of as opposed to the for?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, my own remarks were, I think, pretty self-consciously confined to the American experience and experiment, although obviously I kind of draw on the Pope now and again. I'm not sure that it's exportable always or exportable to everywhere. I think we in this country have been blessed by relatively stable, political order, right? We've had relatively smooth transitions from administration to administration. We've achieved a stability in our political community that has rarely, if ever, been achieved anywhere else, and certainly we can't take for granted, but it's not enjoyed by most people. So it's possible that religious freedom is going to have a harder time flowering and taking root, especially this freedom for religion, which really requires the government to be willing to sort of concede its own weaknesses. It's possible that is going to be tough to sustain and build in a political community where the government doesn't feel like it's in a position where it can ever concede any weaknesses. I'm not sure. The freedom from religion approach might look a lot more attractive in some political climates than it should or does in ours. How about way in the back, yellow tie? Yeah.
One of the difficulties I've had with your argument is you never define religion. And so this undefined concept of religion is assumed to be either good for the common good or at least benign. But in my own experience, there's at least one freedom for example that I had to deal with. I was in the Navy working with a chaplain and was approached by a sailor who wanted to conduct his Satan worship on the ship. The chaplain and the captain approached legal counsel and were told that they had to provide the Satan worshiper with space and time and equipment to conduct his worship. I mean, is there any particular reason why you haven't defined religion?
Well, what particular reason is it? I wouldn't know how. But I'm in pretty good company. Let me finish this. I'm in pretty good company in not being able to define with the precision that we might like what religion is. But with respect to your example about Satanism, I mean, on the freedom of religion approach, which again has as its hallmarks of even-handedness, neutrality, and so on, one does confront this. You see this in the school voucher debate whenever people invoke sort of the possibility of the Madrasa school. Right? One does confront the problem that if the government puts itself in a position where it has to treat all religions the same, or religion and non-religion the same, that it will be in this, what might seem to us, it certainly seems to me, is a bizarre situation of having to provide a Satan chaplain for a Satan worshiper. Maybe that's a weakness in the freedom of religion approach. With respect to all of these approaches, though, with respect to the American model of healthy secularism generally, and I think you see this in Dignitatis, you see this in Deus Caritas S, is this idea that the political community does have the moral right to try to, to secure the common good, to support basic political order and all these kinds of things, and religious freedom can be limited when necessary to serve those ends. I can imagine it being the case that with respect to some religiously grounded claims to human sacrifice, for example, we're not going to be troubled by the government saying, no, you can't do that. We're not going to think that's a huge betrayal of religious freedom. Perhaps the same thing is true with respect to Satan worshippers. Who's calling me?
What would you have counseled the legal counsel who they consulted on SHIP?
I guess one thing I would have counseled, but I suspect the question knows better than I do whether this is true, is that I'd invoke the heavy deference that our courts and laws have traditionally given to decisions in the military context about what's necessary for good order and discipline. But I can't. It's a tricky situation.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to maybe in part say a word in defense of Europe. We've talked a little bit about this kind of American genius and secularism and focused on separations, and we can even impute that to Gregory. But it seems to me that in a real context, separationism has led towards three things, only one of which is Blaine amendments, for one. The separationist jurisprudence that you did talk about, and the extension, the rephrasing of this, not separation of church and state, but separation of religion and politics. On the other hand, when I look to Canada, or look to Germany, I see some problems that we struggle with relatively well, that is, in particular in education. So I'm not sure that I want to kind of think about the genius of America and exporting it without looking at whether we might import some things from abroad.
Sure. I mean, you make a great point that America is actually highly anomalous in being so resistant for most of our history anyway to public funding for religious schools. Now, James Madison, if he could plop down and join us here, would say, yeah, I told you so. Public funding of religion tends to corrupt religion and degrade it and weaken it and reduce its esteem in people's eyes. But I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think one of the things that the American model should, and increasingly is, embracing is this idea that it's not a grave threat to constitutional government or to religious freedom for the government to fund religious education, as most European countries do. Now, most European countries also give minimal freedom to those schools to hire and fire along religious lines.
We have time for one more question.
I was wondering, so it seems that part of the motivation for the freedom of model is the trumping of individual rights over and above the rights of institutions. I was wondering if you thought that was right, and if we even have the resources in political discourse or law to talk about the freedoms of institutions that aren't just reducible to the freedoms of individual persons.
Well, that's a great question. That's dear to my heart. I think in many respects, Americans' legal thinking and political conversations has a tough time thinking about the place of groups and associations and institutions. I think the Freedom for model, one of the things that commends it, to me anyway, is the way that it can take on board the fact that institutions play a structural role in the political order, and that institutions are the subject of religious freedom rights. They're not just aggregations of individuals who happen to be in the same place. They really are. There's such a thing as corporate religious freedom. That's what the freedom of the church is. The freedom of model struggles with that. The freedom for model embraces it, because the government could say, or we could all say, as we are the government, right? One of the things that is necessary for religious freedom to thrive is an infrastructure that includes not only legal mechanisms and courts and all that good stuff, but thriving, distinct religious institutions that operate as kind of very Tocquevillian, right? As sort of counterweights to government that help to, they serve as sites where people are educated and formed and become citizens. So I think it's essential. It's essential that we expand our thinking to include churches, institutions, groups, associations, and I think the Freedom for model helps us to do that.
We are at the end of our hour, so we only have one responsibility, and that is to